Imagine the heart of the Roman Empire beating with force. The entire world seemed to bow before the absolute power of Rome. No nation, no people, no force seemed capable of stopping its expansion. But then, in a single day, everything changed. 3 legions, the elite of the Roman army, disappeared into the dense fog of a treacherous forest. When the news reached Rome, Emperor Augustus himself, overcome with despair, is said to have cried out in his palace, "Varus, give me back my legions!" The Battle of the Teutoburg Forest was not just a military defeat, it was a collective trauma for an empire that considered itself invincible. The person responsible for this disaster? Publius Quinctilius Varus, a Roman general and politician who could never have imagined that his name would forever be marked in history as synonymous with failure. But how did a man who built a solid political career with the support of influential figures end up leading Rome to its worst military humiliation? The answer begins long before the ambush. It begins behind the scenes of power, in the political intrigues and power struggles that shaped Varus's fate. To understand what led to the tragedy, we need to look at this man's trajectory and the illusion that led Rome to underestimate a silent and deadly enemy. But before we continue, stop and imagine for a moment. What would you do if you were a Roman commander, surrounded by thousands of barbarian warriors with no escape route? What decision would you make? Would you fight to the end or try to escape? This is the brutal reality that Varus would face, and that is exactly what we are going to uncover now. For the Romans, conquest was a habit. The imperial army marched through foreign lands like a relentless storm, absorbing peoples, cultures, and territories. From North Africa to the heart of Europe, there was no enemy worthy of the Roman legions. With each battle won, confidence grew. The Senate and the people believed that no barbarian people could challenge Rome and survive. Germania, however, was different. It was a wild land, with dense forests, treacherous terrain, and a warlike people who did not take kindly to foreign rule. But Rome, in its arrogance, saw the Germans as mere disorganized rebels, incapable of posing a real threat. This misjudgment would cost it dearly. In the year 9 AD, Publius Quinctilius Varus was appointed to govern Germania. His mission was to consolidate the Roman presence and transform the region into a stable province. He took with him 3 seasoned legions, veterans who had fought in the empire's campaigns. In the eyes of Rome, this force was more than enough to maintain order. But Varus and his superiors were about to learn the hard way that on the battlefield, overconfidence can be as fatal as an enemy's blade. Now imagine yourself in the shoes of these soldiers. You are a Roman legionary, trained to fight in rigid formations, accustomed to well-built roads and open battlefields. Suddenly he finds himself surrounded by gigantic trees in a dark and silent forest. With each step, fear sets in. Something is not right. But when he realizes the danger, it is already too late. Who was Publius Quinctilius Varus? The man behind the tragedy. Varus was not a born warrior. He did not build his reputation on the battlefield, but rather in the corridors of power. Born into a noble family but without great fortune, he had to use his intelligence and strategic alliances to rise through the political ranks of Rome. His marriage to a woman from the powerful imperial family was one of his greatest assets, guaranteeing him the favor of Emperor Augustus. Roman politics was a game of alliances, favors, and betrayals, and Varus knew how to play it well. He was governor of Africa and Syria, where he dealt with rebellions and fiscal crises, always ensuring that Rome's coffers remained full. His main quality was his administrative ability, not his military skill. Even so, he was chosen to lead the legions in Germania. The problem? He believed he could rule the Germans as he had ruled a Roman province. He imposed high taxes, enforced harsh laws, and treated the tribal leaders with contempt. He did not see the Germans as a fierce, warlike people, but rather as backward peasants who would soon bow to Roman rule. What he did not know was that while he was arrogantly implementing his policies, one of his closest allies was preparing his downfall. A man whom Varus would never suspect of treason. A man who smiled as he plotted his revenge. Now tell me, have you ever trusted someone who turned out to be your worst enemy? That was the deadly trap Varus fell into. Rome's history was full of betrayals, but few were as devastating as the one that was about to unfold. Arminius was a Germanic warrior who had served in the Roman army, learning its tactics, its strengths, and its weaknesses. He spoke fluent Latin, dressed like a Roman, and earned Varus's trust. But deep down, he never forgot his roots. While Varus ruled with an iron fist, Arminius spun his web of deceit. He became the link between the Romans and the Germanic tribes, feigning loyalty while secretly uniting the rival clans under a single goal, the total destruction of the Roman legions. Varus's trust was absolute. He believed he had complete control over the situation. He was about to lead his troops deep into the Teutoburg Forest, certain that he was just carrying out another routine patrol. But the truth is that he was leading his legions into an abyss of no return. And if you were in his place, would you have realized the trap before it was too late? And so we come to the crucial moment. The legions are marching, confident, unaware that the shadow of death is already surrounding them. Varus's fate is sealed. But how exactly did the betrayal unfold? And why was Rome never able to avenge this defeat? Believe me, what happened in the Teutoburg Forest was much worse than you imagine. Publius Quinctilius Varus's fate seemed sealed from an early age. He was not a military prodigy like Julius Caesar, nor a charismatic leader like Mark Antony, but that was never a problem. In Rome, true power lay not only on the battlefield, but in the halls of the Senate, at aristocratic banquets, and in alliances sealed far from the eyes of the people. Varus understood early on that to rise, it took more than military glory. It required cleverly navigating the game of politics, where a proper handshake was worth more than a sharp sword. Born into a family that had seen better days, Varus did not inherit the riches of a powerful dynasty or a name that automatically elevated him to the Roman elite. His father, Sextus Quinctilius Varus, had been a respected man, but he had not left his son an empire. Without this natural springboard, he had to forge his own path, and he did so in the only way possible for a man of his position, by becoming a shrewd politician, and above all, by being useful to the most powerful men in Rome. His first great asset was to realize that Rome was not just a battlefield, but an intricate web of alliances and interests. Generals needed political support, senators needed loyal governors, and the emperor needed trustworthy men to administer the far reaches of the empire. Varus became just such a man. He knew how to approach the right people, strengthen political ties, and most importantly, use marriages as strategic weapons. In Rome, a well-chosen marriage was worth more than a military victory, and Varus did just that. He married Vipsania Marcella, granddaughter of Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, one of the most influential men in the empire and right-hand man of Augustus himself. This marriage was not just a marital arrangement, but a direct passage to the highest circles of power. With this connection, Varus found himself increasingly close to the emperor, achieving positions that put him in a position of advancement. Marriage opened doors that previously seemed unattainable. Suddenly, he was no longer just any senator, but a rising name, capable of being considered for important missions within the empire. And Rome always needed competent administrators to keep its vast structure functioning. The provinces required firm governors, and this was how Varus began his journey into positions of power. The first major challenge came in Africa, a province that, despite being relatively peaceful, required a ruler capable of maintaining order and, above all, ensuring the flow of tribute to Rome. For Varus, governing Africa was a test. He needed to show that he was capable of administering without causing major problems. And during his tenure, he managed to fulfill this role without major scandals. This was enough for Augustus to look upon him with even greater confidence. The real test, however, came when he was sent to Syria, an extremely strategic but also volatile province. Syria was a melting pot of cultures, a point of contact between Rome and the kingdoms of the East, full of political and administrative challenges. There, Varus revealed a side that would define his career, his obsession with tax collection. He was not just a harsh administrator, he became synonymous with fiscal oppression. His name became associated with unpopular measures, with a rigid and, for many, greedy government. Some say he saw the provinces as gold mines to be exploited to the maximum without worrying about the consequences. For the inhabitants of Syria, his administration was characterized by harshness, but in Rome, as long as the coffers of the empire were full, the dissatisfaction of the governed people mattered little. This trait of his personality, the belief that power was supported by order and fiscal rigor, was what caught the attention of Augustus when the need arose for a governor for Germany. This territory, inhabited by tribes considered barbarians, was not an easy place to govern, but Rome wanted to consolidate its dominion there, transforming the region into a peaceful and productive province just as it had done with so many others during its expansion. The emperor needed someone to organize the province and keep the tribute flowing. To Augustus, Varus seemed like the perfect choice. He had experience managing difficult regions and, more importantly, knew how to move money to Rome. What no one questioned, however, was whether he had the sensitivity to deal with a people so different from any he had ever ruled. To Varus, Germania seemed less of a challenge than Syria. He believed he was dealing with disorganized barbarians who could pose no real threat to Rome's power. After all, he saw the Germans as scattered tribes without a central command, a unified army, or a structure that could rival the great Roman war machine. This belief led him to profoundly underestimate the territory he was about to govern. What Varus didn't know was that his greatest weakness was about to be tested. Because in Germania, alliances weren't made with words and promises alone, they were forged on the battlefield, with blood oaths and often with unexpected betrayals. There, loyalty was far more fragile than he could have imagined, and while Varus was consolidating his position, a young German warrior named Arminius was already plotting the first steps in a plan that would change the fate of the Roman Empire forever. Now imagine yourself as a Roman soldier, newly arrived in Germania, marching under the command of Varus, confident in Rome's supremacy. You're deep in unfamiliar territory, surrounded by thick forests and invisible enemies. Everything seems under control, until suddenly the whispers begin. Rumors circulate that something is wrong, that the Germans aren't as submissive as they seem. The air is heavy, you feel it. But did Varus feel it? Varus considered himself an experienced governor, capable of administering any Roman province with efficiency and authority. He had already dealt with rebellious tribes, extorted taxes in hostile lands, and made the name of Rome feared. To him, Germania was just another land to be pacified. But there was something there he did not realize, a silent force growing in the shadows, ready to turn his confidence into tragedy. While Varus imposed Roman law on the land, there was one man who saw each new measure as an affront to the Germanic way of life. Arminius, a young prince of the Cherusci, was no ordinary barbarian. He knew Rome like the back of his hand. Raised as a hostage from an early age, trained by the Romans themselves, and raised to the rank of knight, he had learned to fight like a legionary, think like a commander, and speak like a senator. But deep down, his heart still belonged to Germania, and now he saw his chance to reverse centuries of rule. Arminius did not need a gigantic army. He needed something more precious: time, strategy, and Varus's wits. And that was exactly what he knew how to manipulate. For months, Arminius constructed a web of cleverly woven lies. He became a trusted ally of the Romans, advising Varus on how to deal with the Germanic tribes and making sure appearances were always in check. His words were soft and his demeanor submissive, but while he smiled at Varus in his camp, he sent messengers to the Germanic tribes, gathering forces, making alliances, and preparing the coup that would change everything. Varus, blinded by his own arrogance, didn't see the signs. He thought he was in control, that his position was unshakable. He did not understand that the Germans did not see Rome as a superior civilization, but as an invader to be driven out. He did not realize that each new fortification he built only further inflamed the hatred of those who would rather die than kneel before the empire. Then came the decisive moment. Arminius brought the news that Varus had been waiting for. A revolt had broken out in a remote region of the province. Small, disorganized, nothing more than a nuisance. Varus did not hesitate. He gathered 3 full legions, thousands of veteran soldiers, and marched to put down the insurrection. What he did not know was that he was following exactly the path that Arminius had laid out for him. The Teutoburg Forest was no ordinary battlefield. There were no vast open spaces, no room for traditional military formations. It was a maze of dense trees, treacherous trails, and a silence that hid death. As the legions advanced, the road became ever narrower. The Roman formations were falling apart. The army that had once been a relentless war machine was now a long, fragile line of men, vulnerable to attacks from all sides. That was when the first attack came. Arrows cut through the air, spears appeared from the shadows, and screams echoed through the forest. Chaos ensued. The soldiers tried to fight back, but the enemy was invisible, attacking and disappearing like ghosts among the trees. Each Roman advance was met by new ambushes. Each attempt to regroup was frustrated by the lack of space. It rained, the ground turned to mud, shields slipped from hands, armor became heavy burdens. Varus tried to maintain control, but for the first time in his life, he realized that he was facing something he did not understand. He was not dealing with disorganized rebel tribes, but with an enemy who knew every detail of the terrain, who used the forest as a weapon, and who had something that his soldiers did not have: the fury of those who fight for their land. The massacre did not last for hours, it lasted for days. 3 entire legions were exterminated one by one, without mercy, without escape. The Roman army, which had for so long seemed invincible, now lay on the forest floor, its imperial eagles captured, its banners trampled underfoot. Varus then understood the weight of his defeat. His arrogance had blinded him, his confidence had betrayed him. He could not bear the weight of failure. In a last act of desperation, before the Germans captured him, he fell on his own sword, sealing in blood the greatest military disaster of the Roman Empire. But the impact of the Battle of Teutoburg would not be limited to that forest. When news of the battle reached Rome, Augustus himself was said to have panicked. It is said that he wandered around the palace, banging his head against the walls and repeating, distraught, "Varus, give me back my legions!" Rome had been humiliated as never before. The dream of expanding the empire to the far reaches of Germania had collapsed, and from that day on, the Rhine frontier would become a definitive barrier. Varus's defeat was not just the loss of 3 legions. It was the end of an era of unbridled expansion. It was the moment when Rome realized that its power was not unlimited, that there were peoples willing to resist to the end, that not everything could be conquered by force of arms. But the question that remains is, could this defeat have been avoided? Could Varus have foreseen what was coming? or was his fate already sealed from the moment he set foot in Germania? Rome had always prided itself on its invincibility. Its legions were feared throughout the known world, its roads crossed continents, and its banners shone in the sun of distant lands. But something had changed. The massacre in the Teutoburg Forest was not just a military defeat, it was a blow to the soul of the empire. The impact of this tragedy was immediate. Emperor Augustus, a man accustomed to absolute control, lost the ground beneath his feet. Chronicles say that upon receiving the news, he shut himself in the palace, refusing visitors, pacing back and forth, muttering like a tormented man. He repeated over and over, as if the words could change the past. "Varus, give me back my legions!" But they would not return. They were forever buried in the Germanic mud. Rome could not allow such a humiliation to go unpunished. The empire needed to react, not only to regain its pride, but to reassert its dominance. But how could it take revenge on an invisible enemy who had no cities to conquer, no walls to tear down? The answer came in the form of Tiberius. The general, known for his rigid discipline and strategic mind, was tasked with restoring Roman control over Germania. He knew that a campaign of revenge would not suffice. If Rome was to regain its strength in the region, it would need to do more than simply send troops. It would need to rethink its approach. Tiberius's first decision was to avoid Varus's mistakes. No underestimating the enemy. No marching blindly into the unknown. He organized calculated expeditions, studied the terrain, reinforced the borders, and made sure that each legion was prepared for the Germans' ambush tactics. But there was an even bigger question. What to do with the forgotten battlefields in the forest? The site where Varus's legions were slaughtered was not just a symbol of defeat. It was an open-air cemetery. Years after the massacre, when the Romans returned to the forest, they found a macabre scene. Bones scattered across the ground, equipment corroded by time, broken shields, twisted swords. It was as if time had stopped at that fateful moment, preserving the horror of defeat. And among these remains, something caught his attention. The imperial eagles, sacred symbols of the legions. These golden banners were not just flags, they were the soul of the army, and their capture was the greatest dishonor a commander could suffer. Tiberius knew that as long as the eagles were in enemy hands, Varus's defeat would continue to haunt Rome. It was an open wound that needed to be closed. But recovering these banners would not be an easy task. The Germans did not keep them together. They had been scattered among different tribes, each one guarding its share of the war trophy. The operations to rescue the eagles became special missions, almost legendary. They were not just battles, but acts of redemption. Each recovery was celebrated as a triumph, a step towards restoring the honor of the legions. And one by one, the eagles were reconquered. But was that enough to erase the trauma? The Roman Empire had learned a bitter lesson. There were places where its glory could not reach, and Germania, with its endless forests and indomitable warriors, would become one of those territories. The Rhine line was consolidated as the definitive border. The dream of conquering Germania was abandoned. Rome would continue to exist for centuries, but it would never again attempt to transform those lands into one of its provinces. Now imagine for a moment that you are a legionary on that expedition, stepping into the forest where so many soldiers fell. What would you feel when you saw the remains of your comrades scattered on the ground, when you touched the rusty weapons that were once held with pride? Would fear speak louder, or would the thirst for revenge make you move forward? Imagine a world where Rome had never been defeated in Germania. A world where the legions had marched unopposed into the heart of barbarian territory, crushing every tribe in their path, transforming villages into provinces, and replacing ancient rituals with the laws of Rome. Imagine golden banners flying over lands where the Druids once performed their sacred rites, paved roads replacing muddy forest trails, and entire cities rising where only scattered villages had once stood. What would history have been like if the Rhine frontier had never been a limit to Roman advance? Would the fate of Europe have been different? Would the Germanic language have disappeared, replaced by Latin, as it had in Gaul? But that was not the reality. Rome, which had so often turned its enemies into allies or subjects, found in Germania an obstacle that not even its most brilliant generals could overcome. Varus's defeat was not just a military setback, it was a deep trauma, a wound that Rome could never heal. For centuries, the Roman war machine seemed unbeatable, capable of subduing any people, of subduing any king. But in the darkness of the Germanic forests, 3 entire legions were massacred. Not just defeated, but annihilated, their standards captured, their bodies scattered in the mud as a brutal warning. Rome was not invincible. Germania became a cursed territory for the Romans. Emperor Augustus himself, upon hearing the news of the tragedy, was in despair. It is said that for weeks he paced up and down his palace, banging his head against the walls and repeating, "Varus, give me back my legions." The empire, which seemed unshakable, saw its aura of supremacy shattered, and from that moment on, Germania ceased to be seen as a future province and began to be seen as a dangerous frontier, a wild territory where the very fate of Rome could be undone. And while Tiberius consolidated the Rhine line, ensuring that the disaster would not be repeated, one name echoed among the Germans as the one largely responsible for this historic turnaround: Arminius. But he was not just a barbarian warrior, a tribal chief like so many others. He was a man who knew the Romans inside out, who understood their methods, their tactics, their weaknesses. Arminius grew up within the Roman system, was trained by its generals, fought under the imperial eagle. He spoke Latin, wore Roman armor, and thought like a legionary. But at some point, something changed. He decided that he would not be a servant of the empire. He decided that he would not accept seeing his land become just another province. He decided to betray Rome. And his betrayal was devastating. In a stroke of genius, he convinced Varus that the Germans were under control, led his legions into the treacherous forests, and there struck the death blow. He had not only defeated the Romans, he had utterly destroyed an army that should have been invincible. It was a feat that no one had ever achieved. The giant had bled. But what then? What happened to Arminius after the battle? Did he become the absolute king of the Germanic tribes? Did he live to see Rome give up its lands? Or was the victory over the Romans merely the beginning of a new war, this time among the Germans themselves? The barbarian peoples were never united like Rome. There was no single ruler, no senate, no cohesive administrative system. There were dozens of tribes, each with its own leaders, its own customs, its own interests. They would band together when faced with a common enemy, but without this external threat, they would quickly revert to their internal disputes. Arminius, despite being the great hero of the victory against Varus, soon discovered that the greatest challenge was not to defeat Rome, but to govern his own people. He tried to be more than a military leader. He tried to create a unified Germanic kingdom, something that could rival Rome and ensure that his people would never again be threatened by the empire. He dreamed of a strong, structured Germania, capable of dictating its own destiny. But the tribal chiefs themselves saw this as a danger. They did not want to exchange Roman rule for the rule of a single man. For them, Arminius ceased to be a hero and became a threat. After all, if he managed to defeat the Romans, who could guarantee that he would not try to impose his will on the other chiefs? And so it was that years after the great victory in the forest, Arminius was betrayed by his own people. Surrounded by conspiracies, he was assassinated by those who should have been his allies. The same man who defeated 3 Roman legions did not fall in battle against the empire, but rather a victim of the internal politics of his own land. Rome did not need to lift a sword to eliminate him. The very fragmented nature of the Germanic tribes did that for them, but did that erase his legacy? Not at all. His name became a legend, a symbol of resistance that spanned generations. To the Romans, he was a traitor. To the Germans, he was a liberator. His victory over Varus was remembered for centuries and in some ways shaped the future of Europe. Had Rome won and conquered Germania, the history of the continent would have been completely different. The languages, the cultures, the very nations we know today might not have existed. And here we come to a fascinating question. Which is harder? Defeating an external enemy or keeping your own people united? The victory over Rome was great, but the lack of unity among the Germans prevented it from developing into something greater. If you were in Arminius's shoes, would you try to unite the tribes or follow the path of a lone warrior, knowing that fragile alliances could be your downfall? History shows that defeating an empire can be difficult, but sometimes the real challenge begins after victory. What about you? What would you do in his place? And so we come to the end of the story of Varus, the general who lost 3 legions in a single day. He believed that Germania posed no threat to Rome, but in the end, he was surprised by the unexpected resistance of the barbarians. This reminds us that things are not always what they seem, and even the greatest forces can fall when least expected. Be careful, because sometimes overconfidence can be the first step to failure.